Find somewhere comfortable, somewhere your body can be heavy for a while. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to remember a single word. Just let the sounds arrive, soft and unhurried, and let them pass through you like wind moving through a quiet room. We're in no hurry tonight. Wherever you are, whatever this day held, you can put it down now, just for a little while. Put it all down. Tonight, we're going somewhere far away. We're going to the Arctic in winter, to a place where the sun doesn't rise for weeks, sometimes months at a time, where the world exists in a kind of sustained ancient twilight, and people have learned, slowly, carefully, across generations, how to live inside the dark. This isn't a story about hardship, though hardship is part of it. It's really a story about adaptation, about what happens when the body is asked to do something it wasn't quite designed for, about how the mind finds its footing in the absence of the one thing it has relied on since the very beginning of human life on Earth. Light. And somewhere in that story, there may be something gentle for you too, something that connects the far north to the room you're lying in right now, to the particular kind of tired you're carrying tonight. So let the words drift in. Let your eyes be heavy. There's nothing to hold on to here. Just a quiet journey north and then slowly, slowly back to sleep. There is a town in Norway called Longyearbyen. It sits on an island called Svalbard, deep inside the Arctic Circle at roughly 78 degrees north latitude. If you were to fly there from London, you would travel for about 3 hours, and when you landed, you would step out into a place that feels genuinely unlike anywhere else on Earth. The mountains around Longyearbyen are bare and vast. The tundra is rust-coloured in autumn and bone-white in winter. Polar bears outnumber people on the island. And every year, around the 11th of November, the sun slips below the mountains for the last time, and it doesn't come back until late January. That's about 78 days without a single sunrise. And yet people live there. Around 2,500 people from more than 50 different countries going about their lives in the dark. Families cook dinner and walk their dogs and sit together in the warm light of their homes while outside the Arctic holds its long, deep exhale. There is something in that image that is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that human life continues, ordinary and warm and connected, even in the absence of the sun. That the body finds a way. That the community finds a way. That something very old in us knows how to be still and patient and present, even when the world outside has gone dark. It hasn't always been easy to understand how this works. For a long time, scientists assumed that the polar night was simply a problem to be endured. A deficit. A gap in the light that the body suffered through until spring arrived. But the more closely researchers have looked at what actually happens inside people and inside the ecosystems during the long Arctic winter, the more they found something far more interesting than simple deprivation. They found adaptation, resilience, and in some cases, something that looks almost like flourishing. We'll come to all of that in time. For now, just let yourself settle a little deeper. The night is long. We have nowhere to be. Chapter 1. The Geometry of Darkness. To understand why the Arctic goes dark, you have to begin with a tilt. The Earth doesn't orbit the sun standing perfectly upright. It leans. About 23.5 degrees off vertical. A quiet, ancient slant that has existed for billions of years and that shapes almost everything about the way life on this planet experiences time. The seasons, the length of days, the particular quality of afternoon light in October, all of it flows from that one slow lean. In the northern hemisphere's winter, the top of the earth tilts away from the sun. The further north you go, the more dramatic this tipping becomes. At the Arctic Circle itself, which sits at about 66.5 degrees north latitude, the sun just barely grazes the horizon on the winter solstice and then disappears again. One day of darkness at the very edge. But go further north, and the darkness stretches. At Tromsø in northern Norway, about 69 degrees north, the polar night lasts from late November to late January. About 2 months. At Longyearbyen on Svalbard, closer to 78 degrees, it lasts from November to late January, roughly 10 weeks. And at the North Pole itself, the sun sets in late September and doesn't rise again until late March. About 179 days. Nearly 6 months of continuous night. And here is something worth knowing, something that surprises almost everyone who first hears it. The polar night is rarely completely dark. The word night conjures something absolute. The kind of darkness you find in a windowless room, a total sourceless black. But the Arctic winter is far more nuanced than that. Sunlight, even when the sun is well below the horizon, bends and scatters through the atmosphere. It refracts over the curve of the earth, painting the sky in ways that are, by many accounts, among the most beautiful things a human being can witness. There are different grades of this twilight, and scientists have given them names. When the sun is just a few degrees below the horizon, there is what's called civil twilight, enough light to see clearly, to walk outside without a torch, to make out the shapes of mountains against the sky. When the sun drops a little further into what's called nautical twilight, the light becomes more diffuse, softer, the world rendered in outlines and suggestions rather than sharp edges. And when the sun drops further still into astronomical twilight, the sky darkens enough for stars to appear, though a faint glow still lingers on the horizon like the memory of day. Only at the very highest latitudes, above roughly 84 degrees north, does true polar night arrive. A darkness so complete that even the faintest starlight of the 6th magnitude can be seen at every hour of the day. A darkness that is absolute and oceanic and ancient. But in places like Longyearbyen, even in the depths of winter, there is a brief glow around midday. For an hour or two, the sky shifts from black to a deep, saturated blue, then, almost imperceptibly, to violet. Then back to blue again, and then to black. The Norwegians have a name for this. They call it blåtimen, the blue hour. And those who have witnessed it describe something that is not quite sadness and not quite beauty, but somewhere between the two. A quality of light that seems to slow time down, to make the world feel more deliberate and still. Imagine standing at the edge of a frozen fjord in that light, the snow on the mountains holding the blue, the water beneath the ice utterly silent, the sky above shifting through colors that don't quite exist at other latitudes, and knowing that in an hour it will all be gone again, and the dark will return, patient and unhurried, for another 22 hours. There is something meditative about that. Something that asks the human body to recalibrate its relationship with light, with time, with the ordinary assumption that the day will arrive and depart on a familiar schedule. The earth tilts. The sun retreats. And in the north, life adapts. Chapter 2. What happens inside? Now, something about what the darkness does to the body. Not in a way that asks you to concentrate, but just gently, the way you might learn something interesting about an old house you're sleeping in. It's good to know the shape of the walls around you. Deep inside the brain, In a region called the hypothalamus, there is a tiny cluster of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's a small thing, smaller than a grain of rice, but it functions as the master clock of the entire body. It receives signals from the eyes, specifically from specialized light-sensitive cells in the retina, and it uses those signals to coordinate almost everything. When to feel awake, when to feel drowsy, when to release hormones, when to drop body temperature in preparation for sleep, when to speed the heart and sharpen the mind for the day ahead. This system, the circadian rhythm, runs on an approximately 24-hour cycle, and it is exquisitely sensitive to light. In ordinary life, at ordinary latitudes, this works beautifully. Morning light enters the eyes, suppresses the production of melatonin, the sleepiness hormone produced by the pineal gland, and the body knows it is time to wake. As evening comes and light fades, melatonin production rises, and the body begins its quiet preparation for sleep. The rhythm is reliable, almost musical in its regularity. But in the Arctic winter, the light cues that the suprachiasmatic nucleus depends on simply aren't there. Or rather, they're present only in diluted, ambiguous form. The brief midday twilight of Bloody Men might offer a few hundred lux of light. Enough to navigate by, enough to appreciate the beauty of the blue hour, but often not enough to send a clear, strong signal to the brain that the day has begun. Not enough to firmly suppress melatonin. Not enough to set the clock with confidence. And so the clock drifts. Researchers studying people who overwinter in polar regions have found consistent patterns in what happens next. Melatonin secretion becomes less regular. Its peak, which in a normal sleep cycle arrives reliably in the middle of the night, begins to shift and flatten. The amplitude of the rhythm, the difference between the high point and the low point, decreases. This means that the contrast between the body's sleepy state and its alert state becomes less pronounced. The day and the night blur together, chemically speaking, in a way that makes it genuinely harder to feel properly awake during waking hours and properly tired at the right time for sleep. This is sometimes described in clinical terms as circadian disruption. But experienced from the inside, it tends to feel more like a kind of fog. A persistent, gentle heaviness. A sense that time is moving differently, that the hours don't quite have the same edges they used to. Serotonin is also part of this picture. Sunlight plays a role in the brain's production of serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with feelings of well-being and emotional steadiness. Without regular bright light, serotonin levels can drop, and with them the quiet background sense of okayness that most of us take for granted. This is the mechanism behind seasonal affective disorder, the condition known as SAD, which affects millions of people even at mid-latitudes during winter, and which is far more prevalent in the high north. Then there is vitamin D. Its absence, over weeks and months, is felt in ways that are subtle but cumulative. There is also the stress axis to consider. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, the body's primary mechanism for managing stress, can become dysregulated in conditions of prolonged circadian disruption. Cortisol, the hormone most associated with alertness and stress response, normally follows a clear daily pattern, peaking in the morning and falling through the day. When the circadian clock loses its anchoring, cortisol patterns can become erratic, sometimes staying elevated at times when the body should be resting. Over months, chronically elevated cortisol is associated with impaired memory, a weakened immune system, and a general wearing down of the body's resources. Researchers studying men who overwintered at the Argentine Antarctic station Belgrano 2, published in 2023, found something that illustrates all of this very clearly. Over the course of the polar night, the men's sleep duration decreased, even though they were spending more time in bed. Their chronotype, The natural inclination toward morning or evening shifted later, meaning their bodies wanted to sleep and wake at increasingly delayed hours. Scientists call this social jet lag, and it describes exactly that mismatch. The body wanting one thing, the calendar demanding another. But here is something worth holding, something that might feel relevant to you tonight, wherever you are. The body's response to this darkness is not simply collapse, it is adaptation. And for many people, the adaptation is remarkable. Some individuals who live in polar regions report no significant disruption to their mood or sleep at all. Others find that after a period of adjustment, their bodies settle into a new rhythm, slower and more interior than their summer selves, but stable. And a meaningful number of people who have chosen to live in places like Longyearbyen describe something that sounds almost like relief in the polar night. A permission to slow down, to be quieter, to turn inward. The darkness, it turns out, is not only a deprivation. It is also, for some, an invitation. Chapter 3. Life in the Dark Water. Now we go deeper. Below the surface of the Arctic Ocean into one of the least understood environments on Earth. For most of the 20th century, scientists operated on a fairly reasonable assumption about the Arctic winter ocean. Without sunlight, there is no photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, there is no plant growth. Without plant growth at the base of the food chain, most marine life would have no reason to be active. The working model was one of dormancy, of the ocean holding its breath beneath the ice, waiting for spring. It was a tidy theory, and it turned out to be almost entirely wrong. Beginning in the early 2010s, a series of research expeditions began venturing into the waters around Svalbard during polar night, which is not a small undertaking. The darkness, the cold, the ice, the remoteness, all of it makes winter fieldwork in the high Arctic genuinely difficult. But what the researchers found when they got there was worth every difficulty. The ocean was awake. In Kongsfjorden, a fjord on the western coast of Svalbard, researchers diving and deploying instruments during the polar night found unexpected levels of biological activity. Zooplankton, the tiny drifting animals that form the foundation of nearly all marine food webs, were not dormant. They were feeding, growing, in some cases reproducing. Krill were present in concentrations that hadn't been predicted. Fish were hunting, seabirds were diving. The whole ecosystem, far from sleeping, was engaged in something more like a different kind of wakefulness. Some species were actually more abundant in winter than in summer. The darkness, rather than emptying the fjord, seemed to concentrate life in unexpected ways. Part of the explanation involves the extraordinary phenomenon of bioluminescence. In the absence of sunlight, many marine organisms produce their own light. Tiny zooplankton and krill emit a soft blue-green glow when disturbed, a chemical reaction that requires no external energy source. In the dark Arctic water, this creates something almost hallucinatory, clouds of living light drifting and pulsing in the blackness. Researchers have described looking down into the water during polar night and seeing what appears to be an upside-down sky, a vast three-dimensional field of faint stars, all of them moving. This bioluminescence is thought to serve multiple purposes. It may deter predators. It may help individuals within a species locate one another. And it may, intriguingly, help predators above the water, like certain seabirds, locate concentrations of prey by the faint glow visible through the surface. Life, in other words, found its own light. There is also something fascinating happening at the level of individual cells in these Arctic animals. Researchers studying a species of Arctic scallop, Chlamys islandica, found evidence that even during the polar night, when there is no sunlight whatsoever to entrain a biological clock, the scallops continue to show rhythmic patterns of gene expression. Their clock genes, the molecular machinery that drives circadian rhythms, kept oscillating. The biological clock, it seems, is more patient and more persistent than anyone had imagined. It doesn't stop just because the light does. It keeps turning, keeps reaching, keeps trying to find its rhythm in whatever is available. There is something quietly moving about that. The idea of a small shellfish at the bottom of a dark Arctic fjord, its cells still marking time, still maintaining the ancient pulse of a clock that was shaped by billions of years of light and dark cycles. Still holding the memory of the sun, even when the sun is gone. The Arctic winter ocean is not a dead place. It is a place that has found ways to be alive that we are only beginning to understand. And the more closely we look, the more we find that darkness, even very deep darkness, is not the same as absence. It is a different kind of presence, a different kind of time. Chapter 4. The People Who Stay. Now, back to the surface. Back to the warm light of kitchens and community halls and the particular way that human beings gather together when the world outside has gone quiet and cold. Who lives in the Arctic winter? And how do they actually experience it? The people of Longyearbyen are a diverse group. Scientists and researchers drawn by the unique conditions for studying everything from climate change to the northern lights. Miners, though fewer than in the town's industrial heyday. Tourism workers, teachers, doctors. Families who have simply decided that this is where they want to be. They come from Norway and Russia and Thailand and the Philippines and dozens of other countries, drawn by something that is difficult to name precisely, but that seems to involve a desire for a particular quality of life. Slower, more elemental, more deliberate. The experience of the polar night varies enormously from person to person. Some newcomers struggle intensely in their first winter. The fog of circadian disruption, the drop in serotonin, the persistent tiredness that doesn't quite resolve with sleep. These are real and sometimes significant challenges. There is a name for the more severe end of this experience, polar syndrome, sometimes called winter over syndrome, characterized by drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, irritability, a flattening of mood, and a weakened immune system. It is not universal, and it is not inevitable. And yet the long-term residents, those who have made it through 2, 3, 10 Arctic winters, tend to describe something different. Not an absence of difficulty, but a relationship with the darkness that has become, over time, something closer to accommodation. Even, for some, affection. There is a culture in Norwegian Arctic communities of leaning into the winter rather than fighting it. The concept most often invoked is hygge, the Danish and Norwegian idea of coziness, warmth, and togetherness that is perhaps best understood not as a feeling but as a practice. Candles are lit. Warm drinks are made. People gather. The living room becomes a kind of shelter, and the darkness outside becomes not a threat, but a frame, something that makes the warmth inside feel more deliberate and more precious. The northern lights play a role in this too. The aurora borealis, those great slow curtains of green and violet and white that move across the Arctic sky on clear nights, are one of the phenomena that draw people to the high north in the first place. And during the polar night, with the sky dark for 22 or 23 hours out of every 24, the chances of witnessing them are at their highest. Long-term residents speak of the aurora, the way people in warmer climates speak of a beautiful evening. a gift. Something to be grateful for, something that makes the darkness feel inhabited and alive. There is also the social dimension. Researchers who have studied mental health in polar communities have noted that the strength of social bonds plays a significant role in how well individuals fare during the long winter. Communities where people actively engage with one another, where there are shared activities and regular gatherings and a culture of looking out for each other, tend to show better outcomes than isolated individuals trying to manage the darkness alone. This makes a kind of sense. We are a social species. We evolved in groups, around fires, in the dark. The warmth of other people has always been one of the primary tools we have for surviving the night. In Longyearbyen, there are festivals during the polar night, community dinners, ski races run under floodlights, art exhibitions, music. The town doesn't go silent and withdraw. It creates its own light, its own rhythm, its own reason to get up and go outside, even when outside means darkness and cold. And interestingly, some studies have found that for people who choose to live in these communities, who move there with intention and stay with commitment, mental health during the polar night is not significantly worse than at other times of year. In some cases, it actually improves. The reduced social pressure, the slower pace, the sense of being part of something unusual and meaningful. These things seem to offer a kind of psychological shelter that the darkness, for all its weight, cannot entirely erode. There is something worth carrying from that. The idea that our relationship with difficulty, with darkness, with the things that don't go the way we planned, is shaped not just by the difficulty itself, but by the attitude we bring to it, the community we're embedded in, and the small daily practices we use to create warmth and meaning in the absence of easy comfort. The people of the Arctic winter have been learning this for a very long time. The science of light therapy grew, in part, from watching what happened to people in the dark. Researchers noticed that exposing people to bright, artificial light in the morning for as little as 20 or 30 minutes could have a significant effect on circadian rhythm stability. The light, bright enough to mimic the quality of natural daylight, would enter the eyes and reach those specialized cells in the retina, the ones containing a photopigment called melanopsin, which are particularly sensitive to the blue end of the visible spectrum. These cells would send a signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the tiny master clock in the hypothalamus, and the clock would receive what it had been waiting for. A clear, unambiguous message. Morning has arrived. Light therapy boxes, delivering up to 10,000 lux of full-spectrum light, became standard equipment in polar research stations and in the homes of people living through the Arctic winter. Studies showed that regular morning light therapy could advance the circadian phase, reduce daytime sleepiness, improve mood, and restore something closer to the normal rhythm of melatonin secretion. It didn't replace the sun, but it spoke the sun's language, and the body listened. In the evenings, a different kind of light became useful. Red light, the warm, low-frequency wavelengths that characterize sunset, was found to support the body's preparation for sleep without interfering with melatonin production. Unlike the blue-enriched light that signals morning, red light allows the pineal gland to begin its quiet work, releasing the hormone that tells the body it is time to soften and slow and eventually let go of the day. There is something ancient in that. The idea that the colors of the sky at different times of day have always been teaching the body what to do. Sunrise, bright and blue-white, says wake. Sunset, warm and red and gold, says rest. The body has been listening to that conversation for as long as there have been bodies to listen. In the Arctic winter, where neither message arrives reliably, people have learned to create their own version of that dialogue. Bright light in the morning, however artificial, warm, dim light in the evening, consistent sleep and wake times maintained even when the darkness outside offers no external pressure to keep them. These practices are not complicated. But they are, in the language of chronobiology, powerful. They give the clock something to hold on to. They provide what scientists call a Zeitgeber, a German word meaning time giver, a signal the body can use to orient itself in the undifferentiated dark. The same principles apply, in gentler ways, to the kind of darkness that most of us experience. Not the polar night, not 78 days without a sunrise, but the ordinary winter darkness of shorter days and longer nights, of waking before dawn and coming home after dusk. The circadian clock is sensitive to all of it. The morning light matters. The evening light matters. The consistency of the routine matters. The warmth of the evening, the slowing of the pace, the body's quiet permission to prepare for rest, all of it matters more than most of us realize. There is also something worth knowing about sleep itself during the polar night. Residents of Svalbard report sleeping an average of about 10.5 hours during the darkest weeks of winter, compared to around 4 hours during the midnight sun of summer when the sun doesn't set at all. This is a remarkable range, 6.5 hours of difference, driven almost entirely by the presence or absence of light. 10.5 hours. The body, given the dark and the quiet, wants to sleep for a very long time. And yet, even with all that sleep, people often report feeling less restored, less vital than they do in summer. The quality of the sleep changes, not just the quantity. The orderly progression through sleep stages, from light sleep through deep, slow-wave sleep and into the vivid dreaming of REM, can become disrupted when the circadian rhythm loses its anchor. Researchers studying Antarctic overwinterers have found that the usual ordering of sleep phases can shift, with the deep, restorative stages of sleep occurring at different points in the cycle than they normally would. The sleep is long, but it is less efficient. The body rests, but not always in the way it most needs to. This is a reminder that sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness. It is an active, structured, biologically complex process, one that depends on the body's internal clock being well regulated and well timed. The quality of our sleep is shaped by everything that happens in the hours before we lie down. The light we've seen, the food we've eaten, the temperature of the room, the consistency of our habits. All of it feeds into the body's preparation for the night, and the body's preparation shapes what the night gives back to us. The people of the Arctic have learned this not from textbooks, but from years of living in a place that makes the relationship between light and sleep impossible to ignore. They have become, in a sense, experts in something that most of us navigate unconsciously. They have had to make explicit the things that the rest of us take for granted. And in doing so, they have found something worth sharing. That the body is more adaptable than we fear. That the dark, however long, is not permanent. That warmth and community and small deliberate practices can carry us through the places where the light runs out. The blue hour will come again. It always does. Somewhere in the deep water of the Arctic fjord, a scallop is keeping time, its clock genes rising and falling in their ancient rhythm, patient and quiet, tracking the hours even in the absence of any sun to track them by. The bioluminescent krill drift in the dark water, each one carrying its own soft light, each one part of a vast and living constellation that no one above the surface can see. In Longyearbyen, someone has lit a candle. The flame is small and warm and steady. Outside, the sky is the color of deep water, the color of Drutimen, the blue hour, and the mountains are holding it, and the snow is holding it, and somewhere above the clouds the stars are patient and ancient and indifferent and beautiful. The sun is below the horizon. It has been for weeks, and it will be for weeks more. But the town is warm. The people are together. The body is doing what it has always done, adapting, reaching, finding its rhythm in whatever is available, keeping its clock turning even in the dark. The darkness is not the end of anything. It is a season. It passes. Just as this night will pass. Just as whatever you're carrying right now will, in time, grow lighter. Not because the difficulty wasn't real, but because the body is patient and the morning comes and the clock keeps turning even when we can't feel it moving. You don't have to do anything with any of that. You don't have to solve it or understand it or hold on to it. Just let it settle somewhere soft and quiet, the way snow settles on a frozen fjord, gently, without effort, without weight. The words are fading now. The story is finding its edges. Somewhere behind you, the day is already distant and small, already belonging to another time. The Arctic holds its long winter. The ocean keeps its quiet life. The scallop keeps its clock. And you, here, now, in the warmth of wherever you are already beginning to drift. And so we leave it there. The blue mountains. The dark water. The slow pulse of a world that has learned to live without the sun and found, in that learning, something it didn't expect to find. Something worth keeping. Let the north stay north. Let the dark stay distant. Sleep well. There is a researcher named Till Roeneberg, a chronobiologist at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, who has spent decades mapping the sleep patterns of hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. One of the things his data reveals is that latitude matters. People living at higher latitudes, closer to the poles, show more variable sleep timing across the seasons than people living near the equator. The body, it turns out, is not a fixed thing. It is a responsive thing. It is always in conversation with the sky. Roeneberg's research also introduced the world to the concept of social jet lag in a way that made it legible to people who had never heard the term. He described it simply as the difference between when your body wants to sleep and when your life requires you to be awake. For most people at ordinary latitudes, this gap is somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. For people in the high Arctic, in the depths of winter, it can be far wider than that. The body, deprived of morning light, keeps shifting its preferred sleep window later and later. But the school run and the work schedule and the meeting that begins at 8 in the morning don't move. And so a quiet, cumulative exhaustion builds. Not the sharp tiredness of a single bad night, but a slower, heavier thing. The kind of tired that sits in the bones. What is interesting is that some people are naturally more resilient to this drift than others. Researchers studying overwinterers at Antarctic stations have found that individuals with a strong, well-anchored circadian rhythm before they arrive seem to fare better during the polar night. Their clocks are more resistant to drift. They maintain more consistent sleep and wake times. They report fewer mood disturbances. One of the most striking individual stories to emerge from polar winter research involves a British geologist named Gareth who overwintered at a research station in the Antarctic during the early 1990s before the widespread availability of light therapy. In the first weeks of darkness, a kind of novelty and excitement, the extraordinary quality of the night sky, the silence, the sense of being somewhere genuinely remote from the ordinary world. Then, gradually, a flattening. The entries become shorter, the observations less frequent. He writes at one point that he has begun to lose track of what day it is, not because he has forgotten to look at a calendar, but because the days no longer feel distinct from one another. They blur together in the dark, each one beginning and ending without the clear markers that, he realizes for the first time, he had always relied on without knowing it. And then, slowly, something else. An accommodation. A quieter way of being, he writes, near the end of the winter, that he has stopped fighting the darkness and started simply living inside it. That it has become, not comfortable exactly, but familiar. Like a very large room that he has finally learned the dimensions of. The discovery of winter biological activity in the Arctic Ocean didn't happen all at once. It accumulated slowly through the work of researchers willing to do something genuinely uncomfortable, go to sea in the Arctic in winter and look carefully at what was there. One of the key figures in this story is a Norwegian marine biologist named Jørgen Berg, based at the University of Tromsø, who has spent more than a decade leading expeditions into the Svalbard fjords during polar night. Berge and his colleagues were among the first to document the vertical migration behavior of zooplankton during the winter darkness, and what they found overturned a decades-old assumption. Zooplankton, the tiny crustaceans and larvae and single-celled organisms that drift through the ocean, are known to undergo diel vertical migration in summer. During daylight, they sink to deeper water to avoid predators. At night, they rise toward the surface to feed on the phytoplankton blooming there. This migration is driven by light. When light levels change, the zooplankton move. It was assumed that in the polar night, with no light signal to respond to, this behavior would stop. The animals would simply stay where they were, hovering in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for spring. What Berger found was that the migration continued. In the darkness of the polar night, when there should have been no light signal at all to drive the behavior, the zooplankton was still moving, rising and sinking on a 24-hour cycle. The signal they were responding to, Berger's team eventually concluded, was the moon. Even when the sun is entirely absent, the moon still rises and sets, still changes in brightness across its monthly cycle, still casts a faint light that reaches down into the water column. And the zooplankton, those ancient, tiny, seemingly simple animals, were tracking it. Their biological clocks, shaped by billions of years of life in an ocean where light was always the key variable, were sensitive enough to respond to the reflected light of the moon. Sensitive enough to keep their daily rhythm going, even when the primary source had gone away. This is a finding with implications that extend well beyond marine biology. It suggests that biological clocks are not simply sun trackers. They are light trackers in the broadest sense. Any light signal, however faint, however indirect, can serve as a zeitgeber, a time giver for an organism sensitive enough to receive it. The faint glow of bioluminescence drifting through the water. The body listens for whatever it can find. There is also the story of the Arctic cod, Boreagarda sedea, sometimes called the polar cod, which is perhaps the most important fish in the Arctic food web. It feeds the seals that feed the polar bears, it feeds the seabirds, it feeds the beluga whales. Without it, the whole upper structure of the Arctic marine ecosystem would collapse. And the polar cod, remarkably, spawns in winter, not in spring, when the light returns and conditions might seem more hospitable. In winter. Under the ice. In the dark. Researchers studying polar cod reproduction have found that the fish actually require the cold, dark conditions of the Arctic winter to complete their reproductive cycles successfully. The eggs need to develop slowly at near freezing temperatures in the absence of light. Warm them up. Add light. The eggs fail to develop properly. The darkness, for this species, is not a challenge to be overcome. It is a requirement, a biological necessity. The condition under which new life begins. It is a remarkable thing to sit with. The idea that for the polar cod, the darkest, coldest, most apparently hostile time of year is precisely when the next generation comes into being. That the depth of winter is, for this small silver fish, the season of beginning. The Sami people have lived in the Arctic regions of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia for thousands of years. Their traditional territory, known as Sapmi, extends well above the Arctic Circle, and they have been navigating the polar night and the polar day for longer than written records can capture. What is striking about the traditional Sami relationship with the winter darkness is how differently it was framed from the clinical language of circadian disruption and seasonal affective disorder that modern researchers tend to reach for. The polar night was not, in the traditional understanding, a problem. It was a season with its own character and its own demands and its own gifts. The reindeer herds moved according to the season. The fishing shifted. The work of the community changed. And the long, dark nights were the time for storytelling, for the transmission of knowledge from elders to children, for the slow, careful making of things. Tools. The yoik, the traditional Sami form of song, a deeply personal, improvised vocal expression that is sometimes described as the sound of a person's inner landscape. The yoik belongs to the winter, to the firelit interior, to the long hours of darkness that create the conditions for that kind of turning inward. There is a Sami elder named Marit from a reindeer herding family in northern Norway who was interviewed by a cultural researcher some years ago about her experience of the polar night. She described the darkness not as an absence, but as a presence, the particular quality of quiet that arrives with the long night and that makes certain things possible that the busy, light-filled summer does not allow. That is not a clinical description. It is not the language of chronobiology or neuroscience, but it is a description of something real, something that many people who have spent extended time in the Arctic winter report in one form or another. A quality of interiority, a deepening of attention, a sense that the self, stripped of its usual distractions and its usual rhythms, becomes somehow more legible to itself. Modern psychology has a concept that partially captures this. Researchers studying the psychological effects of reduced environmental stimulation, sometimes studied in the context of sensory deprivation research, have found that under certain conditions, when external noise and input are reduced, people often report increased access to their own thoughts and feelings. The inner life becomes louder, not because it has grown, but because the external world has quieted. The darkness in the Arctic winter creates exactly this condition. Not artificially, not in a laboratory, but as a simple consequence of where the Earth is in its orbit. This is, of course, not always welcome. For someone already carrying anxiety or grief or the accumulated weight of a difficult year, the quieting of external noise can feel less like clarity and more like exposure. The thoughts that were manageable during the busy, bright, distracted summer become harder to avoid in the long, dark, quiet winter. This is part of why the community aspect of Arctic life matters so much. The warmth of other people is not just a comfort. It is, for many, a necessary counterweight to the particular vulnerability that the darkness can bring. In Tromsø, the city of roughly 75,000 people that sits above the Arctic Circle in northern Norway and is often described as the world's most northerly city of significant size, there is a cultural institution called the Northern Lights Cathedral, a striking modern building whose architecture is meant to evoke both the aurora and the surrounding mountains. It was built partly as a community gathering space, partly as a statement about what it means to live in the dark. The building is designed to be beautiful from the inside, warm and glowing and alive, even when everything outside is cold and black. It is a piece of architecture that understands something about the relationship between the interior and the exterior, between the warmth we create for ourselves and the darkness we cannot control. The city of Tromsø also has one of the highest rates of antidepressant prescription in Norway, which is one of the highest in Europe. This is a fact that is sometimes cited as evidence for the psychological toll of the polar night. And that toll is real. But researchers who have studied Tromsø more closely have noted something interesting. The people of Tromsø also score higher than the Norwegian average on certain measures of psychological well-being. Life satisfaction. Life satisfaction. Sense of community. Meaning. It is as if the darkness, by demanding something from the people who live inside it, also gives something back, a sharpness of appreciation, a clarity about what matters, a gratitude for warmth and light and company that people in more temperate climates rarely have occasion to feel so keenly. This is not an argument that darkness is good, or that suffering is ennobling, or any of the other easy formulations that sometimes attach themselves to stories about difficult places. It is simply an observation that the relationship between hardship and flourishing is rarely straightforward, that the dark has its own kind of richness for those who learn to receive it. There is a practice that is developed among long-term residents of Longyearbyen, something informal and unwritten, passed down through the community rather than prescribed by any health authority. It involves going outside every day during the polar night, regardless of weather, regardless of darkness, for at least a short time, not to exercise, not to accomplish anything, but simply to stand in the dark air and look at the sky. The sky during the polar night is, on clear nights, extraordinary. Without the interference of sunlight at any hour, the stars are visible with an intensity that people from mid-latitudes rarely experience. The Milky Way, that soft river of light that most of us have seen only dimly through the haze of light pollution, is a presence in the Arctic winter sky, not a suggestion. A presence. A dense, intricate, overwhelming band of light that runs from horizon to horizon, so detailed and so vast that the first time you see it properly, it can be genuinely disorienting. The scale of it, the depth of it, the quiet reminder that the universe is not a backdrop but a place and that you are standing in it. And on the nights when the aurora comes, the experience can be something that people struggle to put into words. The lights are not static. They move. They shift and flow and sometimes pulse, great curtains of green and violet drawing themselves across the sky in slow, unhurried arcs. Researchers studying the aurora, which is caused by charged particles from the sun colliding with gases in the upper atmosphere, have found that it often produces a faint sound as well. A soft, crackling, electrostatic whisper that is difficult to distinguish from silence, but that, on very quiet nights, in very quiet places, can sometimes be heard. A sound from the edge of space. A sound that no one in human history could have explained until very recently, but that people have been hearing and wondering at for as long as there have been people in the north. Standing outside in that, even briefly, even in the cold, seems to do something for the people of Longyearbyen that is hard to quantify but easy to recognize. It returns them to a sense of proportion. The darkness outside is vast and the cold is real. But the sky above is doing something remarkable, and they are here to see it, and that is something. It is enough. There is a gentleness in that practice worth noting. Not a grand gesture, not a resolution or a transformation, just a daily, quiet commitment to going outside and looking up. To remaining in relationship with the world, however dark it is, to not simply retreating entirely into the warmth and waiting for spring. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, writing about finding meaning in conditions of extreme hardship, described what he called the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude toward an unavoidable situation. He was writing about circumstances far more severe than the polar night. But the principle translates. The people of Longyearbyen cannot choose when the sun returns. They cannot make the light come back sooner. What they can choose is how they meet the darkness, whether they light a candle, whether they go outside and look at the stars, whether they gather with their neighbors, whether they find, in the long, dark quiet of the Arctic winter, something worth attending to. And many of them, over time, find that they do. The body's capacity for adaptation is one of the most quietly astonishing facts about being human. Not the dramatic adaptations of evolutionary time, the slow reshaping of bone and blood over thousands of generations, but the immediate, lived adaptations of a single life. The way the body recalibrates, the way the mind finds new ways of marking time, the way a person who has never lived through a polar night in their first winter, and who perhaps struggles, and who perhaps wonders whether they have made a terrible mistake, can arrive at their third or fourth winter and find that the darkness feels, if not like a friend exactly, then at least like a known thing, a familiar weight. A season with its own texture and its own rhythm and its own unexpected gifts. That kind of adaptation doesn't announce itself. It happens in the background, quietly, the way most important changes do. One day you notice that the dark doesn't feel quite so heavy. That the blue hour at midday is beautiful rather than melancholy. That the stars are something you look forward to. That the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of other people and the small, ordinary pleasures of a winter evening are things you are genuinely grateful for, in a way that feels different from gratitude in easier seasons. The darkness teaches that, slowly, patiently, without drama. The way all the most important things are taught.